Hi, thanks so much for listening to this podcast. I'm Gary Zacharias. Back for another, by the way, the name of the podcast is The Apologist Bookshelf. Speaking of that bookshelf, I pulled a book off of it that I've done a couple of previous podcasts on. It's called Raised on the Third Day. Beck and Lacona are the editors. These are several essays that were put together to honor Gary Habermas, who's done so much work on the resurrection of Jesus. And the subtitle of this book is Defending the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus. Now, I've done a couple of previous podcasts. One was Reasons to Start a Spiritual Quest. That's Craig Hazen's article. I did one on the Shroud. I think the Shroud is super interesting, the Shroud of Turin. This time I'd like to look at Chapter 11, Sean McDowell. It's titled, this chapter, The Deaths of the Apostles and Belief in Jesus' Resurrection. And he said, the whole idea that the apostles died as martyrs because they believed in the risen Jesus, they said that's been a popular argument for a long time in favor of the resurrection. But he said nobody's really looked at that claim carefully. And so Sean says, what is the evidence that the apostles actually died for their belief in Jesus' resurrection? And then to what extent would their sufferings and their martyrdoms count as evidence for the reliability of their testimonies? So he says, let's start with Christian creeds. So we get 1 Corinthians 15. We know this one. I've used it in previous podcasts. It's a powerful part here. Something like 25 years after the death of Jesus, it's a creed. And this is what Paul said, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, many scholars buy into this as a legitimate creed. I mean, he says, look how Paul uses that word delivered and received. Those are technical terms that Paul is using to talk about transmission of tradition. And if you look at that creed and you know what you're looking for, many of the words there are not Paul's. So it's a distinct origin separate from Paul. And says the creed was probably organized in a stylized oral form, and there seems to be a Semitic source to it, like referencing Peter as Cephas, that's Aramaic. And then they use that usage, and that, and other things. It sounds like it's very ancient Hebraic narration. So I said, well, when would Paul get this creed to pass along? Well, he could have gotten it during his stay with Ananias after he was converted. That's Acts 9. Might be during his first visit to Jerusalem. That was 3 years later. That's Acts 9 and Galatians 1. Or maybe a later visit before he wrote his first letter. Look in Acts 11, Acts 15, and Galatians 2. So I like this. Sean says, okay, we don't know for certain when Paul got this, but we know that he interacted with leading Jewish figures, with leading early Christian figures in the Jerusalem area. And so he was able to take this material and pass it along on the resurrection. So the main point that Sean is bringing up is that the earliest record of Christian belief is what? It's grounded in the claim that Jesus rose from the grave and he appeared to his followers. So that's central to the story of the resurrection, that the very earliest claims we have say that he did rise and he appeared to his followers. He says we can also see that in the apostolic preaching that you meet in Acts. He says something like a third of Acts is made up of speeches, and the resurrection of Jesus is in most of those evangelistic speeches to both Jews and to Gentiles. So, for example, when Peter speaks at Pentecost, he describes how God appointed Jesus to do wonders, but he was killed by lawless men. And yet, and here's what he says, Acts 2, yet God raised him up, loosening the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Yeah, that's good. So this is a central message in the preaching of Acts. So Sean is quoting another person who says, we can be confident that Jesus' resurrection was from the very first a prominent and distinctive feature of earliest Christian beliefs. And he says it's not just in Acts. He says with the whole New Testament, you go through the New Testament, he said you could skip Hebrews, let's put that aside, but all the major books of the New Testament make resurrection a central focus. And then we get persecution, right? We find out that the early Christians were persecuted for their proclamation of the faith. And the idea of the suffering and the importance of it and the persecution, that's not just in the Gospels. It's throughout the whole New Testament. Paul discusses suffering and persecution in 6 of the 7 letters that everybody says were written by him. It's a central theme in some of his disputed letters as well. So we see it all the way through there. And we see outside the New Testament, that's called extra-biblical record, for what happened to Christians. Tacitus talks about Nero, who was emperor from 54 to 68 A.D. He persecuted Christians. I'm just going to do a little part of it here. It says that these people were arrested. It says a great multitude were convicted. They were wrapped in the skins of wild animals to be torn to pieces by dogs. They were nailed to crosses, burned to death. Nero made his own gardens available for these people to be burned and to act like candles. Circus games said, all this stuff said, this account is accepted by scholars. Nobody doubts that. And it seems like the official persecution was confined to Rome rather than any place else. There's no mention of any other persecution. But that's interesting, isn't it? Now, let's get to the deaths of the apostles. This is what Sean says he wants to focus on for this chapter. So what's the historical evidence for the likelihood, at least, of the martyrdom of all these apostles? People have just talked about them. Oh, yeah, they were all martyred. But what do we know? What's the historical evidence? So he just walks right through it. And this is Sean going through the disciples. Let's take Peter. In John 21, right, there's a reference. Jesus says, when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you don't want to go, to show the kind of death that he was going to have. Pretty cryptic, isn't it? But it's pretty clear. Jesus is calling Peter to become the new shepherd, and he's going to lay down his life just like Jesus did. People unilaterally say that passage does predict the martyrdom of Peter. If you go to a letter by Clement, that's a First Clement, that's a non-canonical document, and it refers to the martyrdom of Peter, and it's dated somewhere around 95 or 96 A.D., so it's a first century source. And so Clement says this, there's Peter, he went to his place of glory. It says Peter and Paul were persecuted and struggled even to death. They said that's a phrase for martyrdom. He says Peter bore his witness. That's referencing martyrdom. We get the ascension of Isaiah. That's another early, I guess, 2nd century Old Testament pseudepigraphal text called the Ascension of Isaiah. And it also references the fate of Peter. And we get other places. Ignatius wrote about him. There's something called the Apocalypse of Peter, Dionysius of Corinth. They all wrote about the death. So the early, consistent, and unanimous testimony is, yes, Peter did die as a martyr. What about Paul? Well, in Clement, First Clement talks about the martyrdom of Paul. I won't take the time to read that. Ignatius, he wrote a letter to the Ephesians, and he's probably referring to the death there as well. Polycarp wrote a letter to the Philippians, and he talked about the suffering of Paul. And see where it says the early, consistent, and unanimous testimonies that Paul died as a martyr. What about James, the son of Zebedee? His death, or his fate, is specifically mentioned in the New Testament in Acts 12. So there's a tradition of the martyrdom there. It's in the Bible, Acts 12, it's in Mark 10, but it's confirmed by later church fathers from the 2nd century onward. So he says it's not quite as strong as the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, but it seems to be consistent. There's good reason to believe that was the martyrdom of James, son of Zebedee. Now we've got James, the brother of Jesus. What do we know about him? Well, the Jewish historian, Josephus, he's not a Christian. He provides the earliest account of the death of James in his book. And it says that passage is undisputed. So it does reference James dying. Put to death by stoning. It seems to be on solid historical ground. And let's see. It says, what about the remaining apostles? Well, there's solid evidence for the martyrdom of the 4 apostles that he just mentioned. He said there are moderately early traditions for Andrew and Thomas. You can't dismiss them as legend. Some even believe that John, the son of Zebedee, died as a martyr. But Sean says he's unconvinced about that one. But he said, we just don't know what happened to the rest of the apostles. We really don't know. But here's the important part. There's not a shred of evidence that says any of the apostles ever recanted their faith. Yeah, so that's really important. Well, but somebody will raise an objection, Sean says, as he gets toward the end of his chapter. Hey, a lot of people have died for their beliefs. Look at the Muslim radicals today. They've taken control of airplanes, flown them into buildings. They've strapped bombs on and gone out into crowded public areas and blown themselves up. So should we consider their claims just as reliable? But he said, we're missing a key difference between modern martyrs and the apostles. And this is important. I want to make sure it's slow enough that we get this. Modern martyrs do die for what they sincerely believe is true. They do. They think, in this case, Islam, let's say, is true, and so they blow themselves up. But here it is. Their knowledge comes secondhand from others. So he said, take an example, the Muslim terrorists who attacked the Twin Towers. They were not eyewitnesses of anything to do with the life of Muhammad. They lived 13 centuries later, and they're willing to die for what? A tradition. People told other people who told other people who told other people, etc., and it came down to them, and they said, yeah, okay, we believe it, and they went out and they killed themselves. Now, that's hugely different. You look at the beliefs of the apostles. Their beliefs came because they experienced Jesus. They were there. They were with him. They heard him. They saw him. They didn't get stories from other people. Sean mentions Acts 1:3, Acts 2:22 through 24. And Sean's ending the chapter by saying just about all scholars acknowledge the apostles had experiences they at least believed were of the risen Jesus. There's a massive difference, and I think this is crucial, a huge difference between dying for a religious idea that you accept because you heard it from somebody else and dying for the proclamation of a faith based on your personal experience. So Sean ends up, he's got a conclusion here. He said, be careful. He said, popular apologists will overstate and say, oh, they all died for their faith. He said, if you carefully look at it, that argument provides at least one piece of a larger case that you can make for the resurrection. The fact that the apostles suffered and died for their faith doesn't really prove Christianity is true, but it shows that they really believed it. They were not liars. They staked their lives on the belief that Jesus had risen from the grave and actually appeared to them. So it said, hard to imagine what a group of ancient witnesses could have done to show greater depth of sincerity and commitment to the truth. So that's just another short chapter, but it's from the book called Raised on the Third Day. It's a fun book to read just because you got all these different authors who are dealing and wrestling with this issue of the resurrection. I think what I wanted to end with was what Frank Turek says on the back cover of this book. The key to everything, including salvation, is the resurrection. If Christ rose from the dead, then Jesus is Lord, and the essential teachings of Christianity are on his authority. On the other hand, if he did not rise from the dead, then, as the first century eyewitness Paul admitted, Christianity is false. That's why Gary Habermas has made the resurrection the focus of his life's work. We should learn from him about how to establish the world's most important truth with facts even the most skeptics will grant. Okay, so there we go. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Is resurrection even possible? And that's what this book seeks to answer. Now, just a warning here. Let me get the exact date that this came out. 2020, so it's a pretty recent book. I'll just say this. You have to be pretty serious to get through this. It's a little heavy reading, but it's excellent. Raised on the Third Day. Well, thanks for being part of this, and we'll do another podcast soon. Thanks. See you later.